When archaeologists opened the tomb of Shepanupet II in Thebes, they expected to find another testament to ancient Egyptian grandeur. What they discovered instead was evidence of something far more disturbing, a skeleton that told a story its owner could never speak while alive. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're investigating one of ancient Egypt's darkest secrets, hidden for 3,000 years beneath layers of golden inscriptions and religious propaganda. This isn't mythology or speculation. This is documented history that Egyptologists have been piecing together from forensic evidence, architectural anomalies, and the deliberate gaps in official records. Before we continue, I need to warn you. What you're about to learn involves the systematic exploitation of young women within Egypt's most sacred institutions. This is difficult history, but it's real history that deserves to be told. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's uncover what really happened behind the temple walls of ancient Thebes. The position known as God's wife of Amun sounds like the highest honor ancient Egypt could bestow. According to temple inscriptions, these women were divine consorts, spiritual intermediaries between the earthly Pharaoh and the most powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon. The official records paint a picture of privilege. These women controlled vast estates. We're talking about properties that generated revenues equivalent to tons of gold annually. They commanded staffs numbering in the thousands. They performed rituals that supposedly determined Egypt's fate. Their tombs were filled with treasures that would make modern billionaires jealous. Temple walls at Karnak are covered with hieroglyphs describing them as beloved of Amun, mistress of the two lands, divine adoratress. Every visible indicator suggests power, prestige, and spiritual authority at the highest level. But here's what made archaeologists start questioning this narrative. Why were these positions always filled by Pharaoh's daughters, never their wives or mothers as in earlier periods? Why were these women required to remain unmarried and childless? Why did the adoption system replace natural succession? And most tellingly, why do architectural surveys reveal hidden chambers and underground passages in the god's wife quarters that serve no documented religious purpose? The official story is incomplete, and when you examine what it deliberately omits, a very different picture emerges. Modern forensic analysis doesn't lie. When researchers examined the mummified remains of several women who held the god's wife position, they found patterns that contradict every official claim about honored service. Shepanupet I, who served from approximately 740 to 700 BCE, shows skeletal trauma consistent with repeated physical injury sustained over decades. We're not talking about accidents. We're talking about systematic patterns that forensic anthropologists recognize immediately. Her ribs show multiple healed fractures, at least 7 distinct breaks that occurred at different times throughout her adult life. Her facial bones reveal impact damage. The pelvic structure shows the kind of chronic trauma that medical examiners associate with sustained sexual violence, beginning in early adolescence. This isn't speculation based on one individual. Multiple gods' wives examined show similar patterns. The skeletal evidence is so consistent that researchers published findings in peer-reviewed journals documenting what they term systematic institutional abuse disguised under religious authority. Think about that. These women were buried with every honor. Their tombs proclaim their divine status, but their bones tell the truth that hieroglyphs were designed to hide. And it gets worse. Chemical analysis of tissue samples where preservation allowed reveals evidence of substances used in ancient Egypt for sedation and pain management compounds, derived from opium poppies and other plants. These women weren't just enduring trauma. They were being medicated to ensure compliance. The physical evidence is damning. But to understand how this system operated, we need to examine the political and economic structures that made it possible. To understand how priests gained power to control Pharaoh's daughters, you need to grasp the unique trajectory of the Amun priesthood over 1,000 years of Egyptian history. Amun started as a relatively minor deity in Thebes, a backwater city during Egypt's Old Kingdom. But when Theban princes overthrew foreign rulers around 2000 BCE and established the Middle Kingdom, they elevated their hometown god to supreme status, merging him with Ra to create Amun-Ra, king of the gods. The new kingdom, beginning around 1550 BCE, brought explosive growth to Amun's cult. Pharaohs attributed their military conquests across the Near East to Amun's favor. They showered Theban temples with tribute gold from Nubia, silver from Syria, slaves from conquered territories, land grants that eventually totaled hundreds of thousands of acres. A surviving administrative document from Ramesses III's reign provides specific numbers. The Amun temples owned 421,000 head of cattle, 433 gardens, 81,000 workers, and controlled approximately 1/3 of Egypt's arable land. This wasn't a religious institution. This was an economic empire that rivaled the pharaoh's own resources. This created a fundamental problem. Pharaohs derived legitimacy from divine mandate. They ruled because the gods approved. But if the priests who supposedly mediated divine will became too powerful, they could threaten that legitimacy. They could withhold the religious ceremonies that confirmed royal authority. They could, in effect, veto pharaonic power through religious means. Several pharaohs tried to limit priestly power. Akhenaten attempted the most radical solution, trying to replace the entire Egyptian religious system with worship of a single solar deity. His revolution failed catastrophically. After his death, the Amun priesthood returned stronger than ever, having demonstrated that even pharaohs couldn't successfully challenge their authority. The lesson was clear. Direct confrontation with the priesthood was political suicide, but allowing them unchecked power was equally dangerous. Egyptian rulers needed a different strategy. The title God's Wife of Amun existed for centuries before it became what we now recognize as a system of control. Initially, it was held by Pharaoh's wives or mothers, powerful women who were already connected to the throne and who used the position to enhance their existing authority. Queens like Ahmose Nefertari in the early New Kingdom wielded enormous influence through this position. They were political figures in their own right, and the God's Wife title was just one element of their power base. But something fundamental changed during Egypt's third intermediate period, when the kingdom fragmented into competing territories. The nature of the position transformed in ways that official records deliberately obscure. A papyrus discovered in Theban archives contains correspondence between royal officials and the high priest discussing arrangements for dedicating a pharaoh's daughter. The language is bureaucratic housing assignments, staff allocations, revenue transfers. But buried in the administrative detail is a revealing phrase, in accordance with terms demanded by the temple as condition for recognition. The priesthood was making demands. Pharaohs were complying, and the terms involved surrendering royal daughters. The Kushite pharaohs who reunited Egypt from their base in Nubia around 750 BCE faced a particular vulnerability. They were foreign conquerors who needed legitimacy. They needed the Theban priesthood's religious approval more than most rulers. The priests had leverage, and they used it to extract unprecedented concessions. The pharaoh's daughter, not his wife or mother, would become God's wife. She would be dedicated young, before marriage. She would take vows of celibacy, preventing her from bearing heirs. She would adopt the next God's wife as her successor, maintaining continuity outside normal royal succession. Most critically, she would reside permanently in Thebes, within the temple complex, under priestly supervision. This arrangement fundamentally altered power dynamics. The pharaoh was surrendering his daughter permanently to an institution he was trying to manage. She would never marry, never produce heirs who might strengthen royal power, and would live her entire life inside a complex controlled by priests. Structurally, this was hostage-taking rendered sacred. Archaeological excavation of the god's wife quarters at Karnak has revealed architectural features that illuminate the system's true nature. These weren't just luxurious apartments, they were sophisticated prisons designed to look like palaces. The residential wing was separated from public temple areas by multiple checkpoints. The sleeping chambers had single entrances opening onto courtyards that were themselves accessible only through guarded gateways. Windows were positioned high on walls, providing light but preventing sight lines to areas outside temple control. Adjacent rooms housed permanent staff who monitored the god's wife constantly. The architectural layout made surveillance simple and escape impossible, but the most revealing discoveries were the underground sections. Excavations uncovered tunnel systems connecting the god's wife quarters to other parts of the temple complex. These passages don't appear on any ancient maps. They weren't visible from above ground. Their entrances were concealed behind decorative panels. These tunnels served no legitimate religious purpose. They were infrastructure designed specifically to provide access routes that allowed priests to come and go from the god's wife's chambers without being observed by anyone except carefully vetted staff. Similar features have been found at temples in Memphis and Heliopolis, where god's wives also resided. The pattern suggests systematic design rather than local improvisation. Someone, probably multiple people across generations, deliberately created spaces that facilitated abuse while maintaining appearances of honorable service. The Midnet Habu complex, where several gods' wives lived and were eventually buried, contains chambers whose functions archaeologists still debate. These rooms are too small for public ceremonies, lack the decorative programs typical of religious spaces, but contain features like drainage systems and stone basins that suggest very specific, very private uses. One chamber, discovered in the 1990s during renovation work, contained walls covered in hieroglyphs that researchers initially struggled to interpret. The texts described procedures using euphemistic language references to purification, sacred union, divine transformation. Only when compared with medical papyri describing sedation techniques did the true nature of these rituals become apparent. The mandatory adoption system was genius from a control perspective. Under the earlier system, when queens held the god's wife title, it passed naturally through royal family lines, keeping authority connected to the throne. The adoption requirement served one specific purpose: ensuring the god's wife's loyalty belonged to her adoptive predecessor and the priesthood, rather than to her birth family and the throne. The woman who adopted you controlled your inheritance. She determined whether you received the estates and authority associated with the position. She evaluated your performance and could theoretically revoke the adoption if you proved unsuitable. This created a chain of obligation running through the priestly institution rather than through royal lineage. Each pharaoh couldn't reclaim his daughter once she was adopted by the previous god's wife. She legally belonged to that succession line now. But here's the cruelest aspect. The system forced previous victims to participate in victimizing the next generation. Amunirdas, I was required to adopt and supervise the initiation of Shepanopet. I later had to adopt and oversee the initiation of Shepanupet II. Each woman who survived the system became complicit in perpetuating it. This wasn't accidental. Making previous victims watch and enable new victims created trauma bonds that ensured silence. It made each god's wife implicated in the system's continuation. It meant that even if a woman wanted to expose what happened, doing so would mean admitting she had facilitated the same abuse inflicted on others. The psychological sophistication is chilling. The priesthood had developed techniques that modern researchers recognize as systematic methods for ensuring victim compliance through forced participation in perpetuation. The god's wife position came with enormous wealth on paper. Temple records document estates controlled by various god's wives generating annual revenues equivalent to approximately 2 tons of gold. Properties included agricultural lands worked by 15,000 laborers, workshops employing 3,000 craftsmen, trading stations in Nubia, and multiple estates throughout Egypt. This created an elaborate illusion. External observers saw wealthy, powerful women managing vast economic enterprises. What they didn't see was that these women couldn't personally access their theoretical riches. Administrative papyri reveal the control mechanisms. The god's wife could make decisions about estate management, but priestly supervisors reviewed all major transactions. She couldn't liquidate assets, transfer wealth to others, or use financial resources to facilitate escape. The money existed on papyrus more than in her actual control. One particularly revealing document survives from the administration of Nitocris I in the 6th century BCE. It's a contract for supplying luxury goods, incense, cosmetics, fine linens, jewelry. The contract specifies enormous quantities at substantial cost, demonstrating material wealth. But marginal notations reveal something else. Instructions about which items should be presented to the god's wife for selection versus which should be provided directly to chambers by standard allocation. She was permitted to select some luxury items, creating the illusion of choice. But basic necessities were simply allocated without her input. The entire economic structure was theater. Real resources flowed through her authority. Real administrative work was required. But ultimate control remained with the priesthood, which could override decisions, restrict access, or revoke privileges entirely. This served multiple functions. It demonstrated the position was genuinely important, not merely ceremonial. It provided work that occupied the god's wife's time. It created incentives for servants and administrators to support the system's continuation, since their livelihoods depended on it. And it made external observers view the position as privileged rather than captive. The system generated enormous revenue that benefited everyone except the woman nominally in charge. Servants received wages. Administrators collected fees. Priests controlled vast resources. The god's wife had responsibility without freedom, authority without autonomy, wealth without access. The god's wife was never alone but never permitted genuine human contact. The system developed sophisticated isolation techniques perfected over generations. Surviving administrative documents describe the reporting requirements for god's wife attendance. Each evening, senior servants submitted written accounts detailing conversations held, emotional state observed, requests made, complaints voiced, visitors received, time spent in various activities, food consumed, prayers completed, and any unusual behaviors. These reports were reviewed by 3 different priestly officials and stored permanently. Servants weren't allies, they were surveillance apparatus. The system enforced this through rotation policies. Any servant who showed signs of developing personal loyalty to the god's wife was immediately transferred and replaced. Papyri document cases of servants removed within days of showing excessive sympathy or inappropriate attachment. One fragmentary text describes a servant named Ti, who was dismissed after attempting to comfort Amunirdas II during what the document euphemistically calls purification procedures. Ti was subjected to public punishment, 20 lashes for undermining sacred service, then transferred to hard labor duties in temple kitchens. The message was clear. Don't form attachments. Don't show solidarity. Report everything or face consequences. Visitors were similarly controlled. The god's wife could receive guests only with prior approval. Visits occurred in public courtyards under supervision. Guards stood at entrances. Servants positioned themselves within hearing distance. Privacy was impossible. When family representatives visited, the god's wife was expected to perform contentment. Any hint of distress was interpreted as failing to adapt to sacred duties. One letter from a pharaoh to the high priest expresses concern about his daughter's adjustment difficulties. The high priest's response, preserved in temple archives, is chilling. Such difficulties are temporary. Additional instruction will ensure proper understanding of her role. Additional instruction meant additional abuse, framed as training. The system operated within Egyptian religious law that had developed over millennia. This provided plausible deniability that made opposition nearly impossible without committing blasphemy. Egyptian priesthoods had always held special status. Temples had always controlled properties. Religious positions had always included elements of service and dedication. The god's wife system fit within these categories while being far more extreme in practice than law explicitly acknowledged. Defenders could argue it was simply an elaboration of established practices. Critics who pointed out the captive nature could be dismissed as attacking Egyptian religion itself rather than questioning a specific institution. No law explicitly authorized what happened in those underground chambers. But no law prohibited it either, because official legal frameworks didn't acknowledge it occurred. The exploitation happened in gaps between what law described and what institutions practiced. This is how systematic oppression operates at civilizational scale, through institutional structures that make horror routine, through religious justifications that make atrocity appear necessary, through legal frameworks that create just enough ambiguity for abuse to flourish in the spaces official language doesn't address. The sophistication is remarkable and terrifying. The priesthood had constructed a system that was simultaneously highly visible and completely hidden. The god's wife position was one of the most prominent in Egypt. Everyone knew it existed. Official records documented it extensively. But the reality of what it meant for the women who held it was systematically excluded from any record meant for public view. Let's focus on one specific woman to understand the human reality behind institutional mechanisms. Shepenupet II, daughter of Pharaoh Pi, was dedicated as God's wife around 700 BCE at approximately age 12. Her dedication is documented in temple inscriptions that describe it as the highest honor. Her father's letter to the high priest, preserved in archives, expresses pride that his daughter was selected for divine service. The public ceremony was witnessed by thousands. By every official measure, this was a celebration. Archaeological evidence tells a different story. Her tomb, excavated in the 1960s, contained the standard treasures and elaborate decorations, but her skeleton revealed trauma that accumulated over more than 4 decades of service. Forensic analysis documented 7 healed rib fractures sustained at different times, facial bone damage consistent with blunt force trauma, severe joint deterioration in hips and knees, pelvic damage forensic specialists recognize as resulting from sustained sexual violence, beginning in early adolescence and continuing for decades, and dental damage suggesting impacts to the jaw. Her bones don't match the official narrative of honored spiritual authority. They match patterns researchers recognize from other contexts of systematic abuse. But here's what makes her story particularly revealing. Shepenupet II left behind more administrative records than most gods' wives. Her estate management documents survive. Her correspondence with officials exists. Her religious texts are preserved. Reading these documents, you see a competent administrator making sophisticated decisions about agricultural production, trade relations, and staff management. You see evidence of intelligence and capability. You see a woman who could have thrived in almost any context. What you don't see is any hint of the trauma her skeleton reveals. The documents are entirely professional, entirely focused on duties, entirely silent about her actual experience. She could write about barley yields and trading agreements, but she couldn't write about what happened in those underground chambers. The gap between the documentary record and the forensic evidence is the space where truth was systematically suppressed for 3,000 years. The chain of succession stretched across 2 centuries. Each pharaoh's daughter dedicated around age 10 to 14. Each living in the same quarters. Each performing the same rituals. Each managing similar estates. Each dying eventually and being replaced by the next generation. We can document dozens of women. Amenerdes I, circa 740 to 700 BCE. Shepenupet I, circa 754 to 714 BCE. Shepenupet II, circa 700 to 650 BCE. Amenerdes II, circa 650 to 640 BCE. Nitocris I, circa 656 to 586 BCE. Agnes Naraber, circa 595 to 525 BCE. The pattern is consistent across generations. Young dedication, lifelong service, celibacy enforced through adoption system, wealth without freedom, authority without autonomy, honor without happiness. Some held the position for over 40 years. Agnes Naraber served for approximately 70 years, dedicated at age 10 and dying around age 85. 7 decades in that system. Think about that timeline. 70 years of captivity disguised as spiritual elevation. 70 years of performing public contentment while enduring private horror. 70 years of managing estates and performing rituals while knowing escape was impossible. What sustained these women? Some probably found genuine spiritual meaning despite the exploitation. Others likely developed the psychological fragmentation necessary for survival in impossible circumstances. Some may have reached genuine acceptance after decades of no alternative. We can't know their internal experiences. We only have their bones, their administrative records, and the architectural spaces they inhabited. But from those sources we can reconstruct the external conditions they endured. The system didn't end because anyone recognized its injustice. It didn't end because victims organized resistance. It didn't end because moral awakening swept through Egyptian society. It ended because Persian conquest in 525 BCE disrupted the Amun priesthood's power. King Cambyses invaded Egypt and dismantled traditional religious infrastructure. The priesthood lost its political leverage. The economic resources supporting the god's wife position were redirected to Persian administration. The last god's wife, Agnes Naraber, lived through the conquest, but wasn't replaced when she died. The political conditions that made the position useful had changed. Egypt was part of the Persian Empire now. The old power dynamics between throne and temple no longer applied. The priesthood lacked leverage to demand that Persian rulers surrendered daughters to priestly authority. The institution that consumed dozens of women across 2 centuries simply stopped. Not through reform, not through revolution, but through political circumstances that made their continued captivity administratively inconvenient. This is perhaps the coldest truth. These women were freed not by principled opposition to exploitation, but by foreign conquest that made their captivity no longer useful to anyone with power to maintain it. Their suffering ended as impersonally as it began, a side effect of military developments that had nothing to do with their humanity or their decades of endurance. Modern understanding of this system comes from multiple categories of evidence that researchers cross-referenced to reconstruct what official records deliberately obscured. First, forensic analysis of mummified remains showing consistent trauma patterns across multiple individuals. Second, architectural surveys revealing hidden chambers and passage systems serving no documented religious purpose. Third, comparative analysis of administrative documents identifying gaps between official descriptions and actual resource allocation. Fourth, chemical analysis detecting sedation compounds in preserved tissue samples. Fifth, textual analysis of temple inscriptions identifying euphemistic language masking exploitation. No single piece of evidence is definitive, but the cumulative pattern is overwhelming. Researchers published findings in academic journals over the past 3 decades as improved forensic techniques allowed more sophisticated analysis of ancient remains. The conclusions were controversial initially. Some Egyptologists resisted interpretations suggesting systematic abuse within sacred institutions. But as evidence accumulated from multiple independent sources, academic consensus shifted. Major universities now teach about the God's wife system as an example of how religious authority can be weaponized for exploitation. This isn't fringe theory or sensationalized speculation. This is mainstream archaeology and forensic anthropology documenting systematic institutional abuse that was successfully hidden for 3 millennia through propaganda that privileged official narratives over physical evidence. Why does this history matter 3,000 years later? Because the patterns it reveals persist in different forms across cultures and time periods. The use of sacred language to mask exploitation, the isolation of victims from support networks, the transformation of resistance into evidence requiring more intervention, the economic incentives making many people invested in system continuation, the official narratives sanitizing history for later generations who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. These dynamics repeat. Different specific practices, different religious frameworks, different cultures, but the underlying mechanisms are remarkably similar. Understanding how sophisticated civilizations construct and maintain systems of oppression matters because sophistication is no guarantee against atrocity. Administrative competence can serve evil as effectively as good. Economic development can coexist with systematic exploitation. Religious devotion can mask abuse. The God's wife system succeeded because it wove together religious justification, legal frameworks, economic incentives, and architectural design into a coherent whole that proved resilient across centuries of political change. It survived foreign invasions, civil wars, dynastic transitions, and cultural shifts. It persisted because it served functions multiple parties found useful, and because challenging it required confronting foundations of Egyptian religion and society. This teaches us to question comfortable narratives about the past, to privilege physical evidence over official propaganda, to examine what sources strategically omit rather than just what they explicitly state, to recognize that honored institutions can simultaneously be mechanisms of exploitation. The past was not simpler or more innocent than the present. It was complex, brutal, and sophisticated in its capacity for exploitation disguised as honor. Shepenupet II died around 650 BCE at approximately age 56. She had held the position of God's wife of Amun for about 40 years. She was buried with every honor. Her tomb proclaimed her divine status. Her inscriptions described her as beloved of the gods. But her skeleton tells the truth those hieroglyphs were designed to hide. She deserves to be remembered not as God's wife of Amun, divine adoratress, beloved of the god, but as Shepanupet, daughter of Pi, captive for 4 decades, dead at 56, whose bones bear witness to truths that elaborate inscriptions tried, but failed to completely erase. Remember her name. Remember what was done to her. Remember that it was systematic, religiously justified, economically supported, and successfully hidden from honest examination for 3,000 years. If this investigation into history's hidden darkness has impacted you, there's another buried truth you need to discover. Click the video appearing on your screen now for another journey into the shadows of the past. And if you found this exploration compelling, hit that subscribe button so we can continue uncovering the real stories behind official histories. These voices deserve to be heard even though they were systematically silenced in their own time. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this dark chapter of Egyptian history. Where are you watching from? Did you know about the God's wife system before this video? The truth deserves to emerge even when lies have had 3,000 years to solidify into accepted history. Remember these women. Question comfortable narratives. And never forget that civilization and atrocity are not opposites. They're often partners when power combines with opportunity and hides behind sacred language. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.